Millionaire's daughter was never allowed outside. Gardener discovers why and acts fast. Imagine stepping into a world where wealth masks secrets, and behind the towering walls of luxury lies a story that will leave you questioning everything. This is the tale of a man who thought he was just tending to gardens, but ended up uncovering something far darker than he ever imagined. In the sprawling estate of a millionaire, a little girl watches silently from behind glass windows. Her eyes filled with sadness and fear. She's never allowed outside, and no one seems to notice, except for the gardener. What he discovers changes everything, forcing him to make a choice that could cost him everything or save an innocent life. The story begins on a crisp spring morning in the meticulously manicured gardens of the Hale Mansion. Dan Wells, a gardener in his early 50s, moves through the lush greenery with practiced precision. His hands are weathered from years of work, but there's a quiet pride in what he does. For 4 months, he has been maintaining this expansive property, finding peace in the rhythm of pruning shears and the scent of fresh earth. It's a job like any other, or so he thinks. Little does he know, today will be different. Today, the tranquility of the garden becomes the backdrop for a mystery that will test his courage and compassion. Christopher Hale, the mansion's owner, is a man in his early 40s, polished and seemingly perfect in every way. He greets Dan warmly as he arrives, exuding the kind of charm that makes people instinctively trust him. But beneath the surface, something feels off. As the day progresses, Chris frantically searches for his 7-year-old daughter, Josalind, a child Dan didn't even know existed until now, when Dan finally sees her peeking out from behind a window, wearing a beanie that covers her head entirely. His curiosity turns to concern. Why is she always indoors? And why does she look so sad? Their first real interaction happens when Dan catches her watching him from inside the house. With a friendly wave, he tries to break the ice, calling out to her through the glass. Her response is hesitant, almost guarded, but when she reveals her name, Jocelyn, it strikes a chord deep within Dan. The resemblance between Jocelyn and his own late daughter, Jolene, is uncanny. Both share not only syllables in their names, but also a quiet demeanor that speaks volumes. As they talk, Jocelyn removes her beanie, revealing her bald head, a stark reminder of the chemotherapy she's undergoing. The sight hits Dan hard, reopening old wounds from his past. He knows all too well the pain of watching a child battle cancer. But it's not just Jocelyn's illness that raises red flags. It's the circumstances surrounding her care. When Dan innocently mentions seeing her to Chris later that day, the reaction is explosive. Chris fires him on the spot, warning him never to speak to Jocelyn again. Confused and alarmed, Dan begins piecing together clues. Over-the-counter hair growth serum in Chris's car, Jocelyn's deteriorating health, and whispers from the nanny about missing doctor's visits. Something isn't right, and Dan can't shake the feeling that Jocelyn's life might be in danger. As the hours tick by, the tension builds. A sudden downpour forces Dan to take shelter in the staff area, where he meets Mia, Jocelyn's nanny. Their conversation confirms his worst fears. Jocelyn hasn't received proper medical treatment in months. The private doctor, who once visited regularly, has stopped coming altogether, leaving the young girl to suffer in silence. Meanwhile, Chris continues to act as if nothing is wrong, brushing off concerns and dismissing anyone who dares question him. The contrast between his outward charm and the reality of his actions grows more unsettling with each passing moment. Just when Dan thinks things can't get worse, Jocelyn appears at the back door of the mansion, tears streaming down her face. She begs for help, clutching at him like he's her last hope. Her words are frantic. describing unbearable pain and difficulty breathing. Every instinct tells Dan to act immediately, but doing so means crossing a line he may not be able to come back from. Still, he knows he can't stand idly by while a child suffers. Armed with determination and a phone call to emergency services, Dan sets off a chain of events that will change everyone's lives forever, including his own. Yet, the road ahead is anything but smooth. When the police arrive, they seem strangely uninterested in investigating further, almost dismissive of Dan's claims. They side with Chris, leaving Dan standing outside the gates, helpless and furious. The system designed to protect the vulnerable has failed Jocelyn, and Dan realizes that if anyone is going to save her, it has to be him. With the clock ticking and Jocelyn's condition worsening, he makes a daring decision, one that could land him in jail, or worse, breaking into the mansion under the cover of darkness. Dan risks everything to rescue the girl who has come to symbolize both his greatest fears and his deepest hopes. As the scene unfolds, viewers are left wondering, will Dan succeed in getting Jocelyn the help she desperately needs? Can he expose the truth about Chris and ensure justice is served? Or will the weight of wealth and corruption crush his efforts before he even gets close? The answers lie just beyond the horizon, waiting to unfold in the next chapter of this gripping story. For now, we're left holding our breath, rooting for a man who dared to step into the unknown, and a little girl whose courage shines brighter than any fortune. Stay tuned for what happens next, because this is a story you won't want to miss. As Dan sat by Jocelyn's bedside, his mind kept drifting back to the moment he had first seen her. The memory of her pale face and bald head haunted him. Stirring emotions he thought he had buried long ago. It wasn't just her physical appearance that reminded him of Jolene, his own daughter, but also the fear in her eyes. That same fear had once shadowed his little girl during her battle with leukemia. Dan clenched his fists under the hospital blanket, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. How could someone like Chris, a man who appeared so polished and successful, let this happen to a child, and not just any child, but his stepdaughter, a girl who trusted him to protect her? Detective Reeves entered the room quietly, her presence breaking Dan out of his thoughts. She pulled a chair beside him, her expression serious, but not unkind. "Mr. Wells," she began, her voice low to avoid disturbing Jocelyn. "We've uncovered some troubling information about Christopher Hale." Dan leaned forward, his full attention on her words. It seems he stood to gain everything if Jocelyn didn't survive. Her mother, Bella Lawson, left behind a substantial estate, all meant for Jocelyn when she turned 18. But without Jocelyn alive, it would go entirely to Chris as the executor. The revelation hit Dan like a punch to the gut. He had suspected Chris was hiding something dark, but this went beyond neglect. It was calculated cruelty. He withheld treatment, Dan said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "That hair growth serum I saw in his car. It wasn't prescribed by an oncologist. He must have thought it would make things look normal, like he cared, while secretly hoping she wouldn't recover." Detective Reeves nodded grimly. "We're still gathering evidence, but based on what we know now, it's clear he prioritized greed over her life." Meanwhile, Mia, Jocelyn's nanny, was being questioned separately. Sitting across from another officer, she wrung her hands nervously, her guilt written all over her face. "I wanted to say something," she admitted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But Mr. Hale, he always seemed to know exactly what to say to keep everyone quiet. He told me Jocelyn was receiving alternative treatments, that they were better than chemotherapy. I believed him, at least at first. Her voice cracked as she continued. Then I started noticing how sick she really was. She'd wake up in pain, unable to breathe sometimes. I begged him to take her to the hospital, but he just yelled at me, said I didn't understand anything. Mia's confession added another layer to the story, painting Chris as not only manipulative, but also dangerously controlling. It became clear that fear had silenced those around him, leaving Jocelyn isolated and vulnerable. As Detective Reeves pieced together the timeline, one thing stood out. Mia hadn't been the only one intimidated into silence. The staff at the mansion spoke cautiously, their loyalty to Chris outweighing their concern for Jocelyn. Even the police officers, who initially dismissed Dan's claims, had fallen prey to Chris's influence, accepting bribes to turn a blind eye. Back at the hospital, Jocelyn slept fitfully, her small body hooked up to monitors and IV lines. The doctors had explained to Dan that her condition was critical, but treatable. With proper care, she had a fighting chance. Yet hearing those words brought both relief and heartache. Relief because she might finally get the help she needed, and heartache because no child should ever endure such neglect. Dan gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch light so as not to disturb her rest. "You're safe now," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." As night fell, tensions outside the hospital grew. Reporters had caught wind of the scandal, their cameras flashing like fireflies in the darkness. The media frenzy surrounding the case painted Chris as a monster, but it also put pressure on law enforcement to ensure justice was served. Inside the building, however, the focus remained on Jocelyn. Child Protective Services worked tirelessly to locate any living relatives who could provide a stable home for her. So far, their efforts had been fruitless. Bella Lawson's family tree ended abruptly after her death, leaving Jocelyn alone in the world. Detective Reeves approached Dan again later that evening, her demeanor more somber than before. "We found inconsistencies in Bella Lawson's death certificate," she revealed, lowering her voice. "There are signs pointing to foul play. If true, this means Chris may have orchestrated not just Jocelyn's suffering, but her mother's demise as well." The weight of the detective's words settled heavily on Dan. Everything clicked into place. The rushed investigation, the lack of documentation, the way Chris never mentioned Bella. He had erased her completely, turning Jocelyn's into a pawn in his quest for wealth. Despite the mounting evidence against Chris, doubts lingered in Dan's mind. What if the system failed Jocelyn again? Wealthy individuals often found ways to manipulate legal proceedings, bending them to their will. The image of the corrupt officers stuffing envelopes into their pockets replayed in his head, a stark reminder of how easily power could corrupt. Determined not to let history repeat itself, Dan decided to reach out to advocacy groups specializing in child protection. They could offer resources and support, ensuring Jocelyn's case received the attention it deserved. As dawn broke, the hospital buzzed with activity. Doctors updated Dan on Jocelyn's progress, explaining that while her road to recovery would be long, she was responding well to initial treatments. Each update brought a glimmer of hope, fueling Dan's resolve to see this through. Outside, news vans continued to line the streets, broadcasting updates about the unfolding drama. Public outrage mounted, putting additional pressure on authorities to act swiftly and decisively. But even as the world watched and waited, uncertainty loomed large. Would the courts hold Chris accountable for his actions? Could Jocelyn find peace after enduring so much trauma? And most importantly, what role would Dan play in shaping her future? These questions swirled in his mind, keeping him awake despite his exhaustion. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. a reason to fight for something bigger than himself. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Jocelyn's fate rested not only in the hands of the system, but also in the compassion of those willing to stand up for her. With each passing hour, the stakes grew higher, drawing viewers deeper into the emotional turmoil of the characters. The climax of the story approached, promising answers, but also raising new questions about trust, justice, and redemption. As Dan prepared to face yet another day of uncertainty, he clung to the belief that love and courage could overcome even the darkest forces. As the days turned into weeks, the full scope of Christopher Hale's crimes began to unravel. The forensic teams working inside the mansion uncovered disturbing evidence, medical records that had been tampered with, prescriptions for over-the-counter treatments instead of life-saving chemotherapy, and even traces of substances in Jocelyn's personal belongings that should never have been administered to a child undergoing cancer treatment. It became painfully clear that Chris had not only neglected her care, but actively sabotaged it, hoping to erase her from his path to wealth. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community, sparking outrage and calls for justice. Detective Reeves kept Dan updated as the investigation progressed. She explained how Chris had manipulated every aspect of Jocelyn's life, isolating her from the world and controlling who interacted with her. He wanted her to fade away quietly, Detective Reeves said during one of their meetings at the police station. But you, Mr. Wells, you refused to let that happen. Your actions saved her life. Despite the gravity of the situation, Dan couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride, knowing he had made a difference. Still, the weight of what could have happened haunted him. Meanwhile, Jocelyn's condition stabilized under the care of dedicated doctors and nurses. The initial rounds of intensive treatment were tough on her tiny body, but she showed remarkable resilience. Each time Dan visited her in the hospital, she seemed a little stronger, a little brighter. One afternoon, as they sat together watching cartoons on a small TV mounted to the wall, Jocelyn turned to him with a shy smile. Dan, she whispered, clutching his hand, am I really going to be okay? Her voice was so soft, so fragile, that it nearly broke his heart. Yes, sweetheart, he replied, brushing a strand of newly grown hair from her forehead. You're stronger than you know. The legal proceedings against Chris were swift and merciless, with overwhelming evidence stacked against him, including confessions extracted during intense interrogations. He was charged with multiple counts of child endangerment, neglect, and fraud. But the most shocking twist came when investigators reopened the case surrounding Bella Lawson's death. Toxicology reports revealed traces of poison in her system, suggesting foul play. Chris's motive became chillingly clear. By eliminating Bella, he secured control over her fortune, leaving Jocelyn as the sole obstacle standing between him and unimaginable wealth. In court, Mia testified about the fear and intimidation she endured while working for Chris. Her account painted a harrowing picture of life inside the Hale mansion, where silence was enforced through threats and manipulation. Yet, despite the darkness of her testimony, there was hope in her words. I wanted to protect Jocelyn, she told the judge, tears streaming down her face. But I was too scared to act alone. When Dan showed up, I knew we finally had a chance. Her bravery earned her immunity from prosecution, though the emotional scars would take years to heal. For Dan, the trial brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that Chris would pay for his crimes. On the other, the process forced him to confront painful memories of his own daughter's illness and loss. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to expert witnesses describe the extent of Jocelyn's suffering, He often found himself gripping the edge of his seat, fighting back tears. Yet, through it all, he remained steadfast, determined to see this through for Jocelyn's sake. When the verdict was finally delivered, it came as no surprise. Guilty on all counts, Chris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel struck, Jocelyn, now sitting beside Dan in the front row, reached out and squeezed his hand. "It's over," she murmured, her voice filled with relief. For the first time in her young life, she looked free, not just from Chris's grasp, but from the shadow of fear that had loomed over her existence. With Chris behind bars, attention shifted to rebuilding Jocelyn's future. Child Protective Services worked tirelessly to locate any surviving relatives who might provide a stable home for her. Unfortunately, Bella's family had long since passed or disappeared, leaving Jocelyn without blood ties to lean on. That's when Laura Miller approached Dan with an unexpected proposal. "You've done more for her than anyone else," Laura said gently. "Would you consider becoming her legal guardian?" The question caught Dan off guard. He had grown attached to Jocelyn, yes, but taking on such responsibility was a monumental decision. Over the next few days, he wrestled with doubts and fears, wondering if he was truly capable of raising a child again after losing his own. But then he remembered the way Jocelyn smiled whenever he walked into the room, the trust in her eyes when she asked him questions, and the quiet strength she displayed despite everything she'd endured. In the end, the choice was simple. "I'll do it," he told Laura, his voice steady with resolve. As months passed, Dan and Jocelyn settled into a new rhythm. They moved into a cozy house with a modest garden where Dan continued to nurture plants and watch them grow, a metaphor for the healing happening within their little family. Jocelyn thrived under his care, excelling in school and rediscovering the joy of childhood. Though her journey wasn't easy, she faced each challenge with courage, buoyed by the love and support of the man who had once been just a gardener. Looking back, Dan realized that saving Jocelyn had saved him too. For years he had carried the burden of guilt and grief, believing he hadn't done enough for Jolene. But in stepping forward to protect Jocelyn, he found redemption, not because he erased the past, but because he chose to shape the future. Their bond became a testament to the power of compassion, proving that even in the darkest moments, one person's actions can light the way for others. And so, as they stood together in the garden one sunny afternoon, planting seeds and dreaming of brighter tomorrows, Dan knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. The Millionaire's mansion and its secrets felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the laughter of a little girl who had fought her way back to life. Together, they had turned tragedy into triumph, finding hope amidst despair and proving that love always finds a way to bloom.